Peter Pan versus Captain Hook, comparing the performance of age and aging in classic rock via Neil Young's Old Man, 1972, and Alice Cooper's I'm 18, 1970. There are at least three false premises that distort and hinder our progress in embracing the fullness and complexity of age as an identity. Number one, that youth and young age are synonyms. Number two, that young age and old age are antonyms. And number three, that age is a fixed, prescribed, biologically based identity. My premise today is that we're forced to confront and make sense of those fundamentally false things, and that we can see that being done if we look to expressive forms where the artist and audience's identities are most closely predicated on something that will not last, like, for example, being young. The qualities we associate with youth are often mislinked, misattributed, specifically tying states of mind to having a short length of time since you've been in the womb. Young people are bound to this monolithic noun, youth. Well, what is the word for non-youth? Adulthood? Maybe. But even more appropriately, grown-up. I actually had my first experience being called a grown-up this February. One of Alice Cooper's guitarists, Nita Strauss, does a scavenger hunt for fans before every show. And on the last night of the Australia-New Zealand leg of the tour, I found the prize pack and I posted a picture. And I got a reply notification. A mom with her very young son had posted a picture with the scavenger hunt hashtag. In her photo, referring to the game, she captioned, "Some grown-up beat us to it," with a frowny face and an emoji of tears streaming down. And for a second, my stomach dropped. I felt very guilty. They had seen my photo and deemed me unworthy. And I thought, was this not for me? Am I that unself-aware? I ended up reaching out to them and I shared the prizes because I wanted to make this a good experience for this kid. But I also knew that when I was doing it, it was almost out of penance. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for taking this opportunity away from your child. And for one second, I almost found myself kind of defensively gatekeeping too. Like, he probably doesn't even know how big of a deal Nita is. But I caught myself, luckily, because that's really the beginning of the end. When you start to write off another group as somebody who probably doesn't get it or doesn't get it as much as you do. It seemed poignant to me that this happened just after I turned 29, the final year before I hit 30, which has never really held any weight for me, but seems to be a big deal in the sort of unidentifiable social zeitgeist. Perhaps it's the oft misused and misunderstood 1964 quote by free speech movement activist Jack Weinberg. He said, "We have a saying in the movement that you can't trust anybody over 30. Spoken to a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, it was then requoted by famous columnist Ralph J. Gleason and later used as a way to sum up the 60s youth counterculture mindset. But Weinberg hadn't been trying to describe the youth mindset. He'd said that in response to this idea that young people involved with the free speech movement were being manipulated and didn't really have any agency in what they were saying. The quote came to mean older people are fundamentally untrustworthy and don't get it, when really Weinberg said the quote to mean ask young people about what young people think, trust young people, believe young people, and what they're feeling, what they're talking about. And that's why it leads me to this quote that I chose to riff off of for the title of this paper and for the premise of my breakdown, that I think quite a lot of classic rock and more general post-war culture has been about untangling fallacious correlations that limit one's identity, undermine someone's lived experience, and misattribute qualities to the general category of age, which is a single word tasked with representing too many meanings. When Alice Cooper says rock and roll is full of Peter Pans and I'll gladly be Captain Hook, what does that mean? At first listen, there's a couple of associations to be made there immediately. One, the aesthetic similarity. The character of Alice dresses sort of like Captain Hook, a gentleman pirate. It also sounds like a playful jab at musicians who he might perceive as trying not to grow up, which is a common tease. The older people are trying to stay relevant, thing that's usually used to shame people for a lack of self-awareness that they're getting older, or at least for not acting their age. And The quote tracks in the way that Alice thrives on that shock role of the villain, the bad guy. But quite a lot of people in popular music still like to do that. The part I love most about the quote, though, that I don't think was his intended meaning, is that Peter Pan and Captain Hook are a great representation of the different facets of age and growing up because they're not that different. They're two sides of the same coin. In J.M. Barrie's original source material, Peter Pan is the antagonist. He's impulsive, selfish, boastful, causing mischief, and it's interesting for Alice to then cast himself in the Hook role when in a way that goes against the core of the Alice persona, which was parents hate us. For a long time, that's how decisions were specifically made in the Alice Cooper camp. Do what will, what will piss off parents because kids will love it. But funnily enough, traditionally in the play, the actor who plays Captain Hook is also the actor who plays George Darling, the father. So if Alice was trying to set it up as protagonists versus antagonists, it doesn't really work because they're both antagonists. And if he was trying to set it up as people who are trying not to grow up versus people who do, there's also kind of a discrepancy there. Because while the performer, formerly known by the name Vince Fournier, and who I'll refer to as such just for the sake of clarity, while Vince the performer does age, Alice Cooper the character does not. I asked him about this specifically in an interview, and he said that in his mind, Alice is always 28. I don't know of anybody else in the rock world, playing a character or not, who actually stays frozen at a certain age as quasi-literally as that. So in a way, he's the only person who can be Peter Pan. And to go one further, we know that Captain Hook is haunted by this alligator who represents death, and the alligator is accompanied by the sound of a ticking clock, which also frequently symbolically represents aging and inevitable death. So perhaps Alice is both Peter Pan and Captain Hook, a character that doesn't age or grow up, who is inextricably tied to a real-life performer who has aged, grown, and will inevitably die. With that deep reading, the strict Peter Pan versus Captain Hook dichotomy isn't as cut and dry as it sounds in the quote, heroes versus villains, white hats versus black hats. If anything, perhaps the difference lies in embracing death. People who think that not growing up will keep them from dying, and people who have died so many times that it seems like death might not come for them. So then, what would it mean to compare somebody who plays both of the Peter Pan and Captain Hook parts to somebody who doesn't fit into either? That's why I chose to compare Alice Cooper and Neil Young, as opposed to somebody like Mick Jagger or Pete Townsend. One of the songs I highlight, perhaps a little on the nose, is Young's 1972 track off of Harvest, Old Man, a song written when he was 24 for Luis Avila, who was the old caretaker of the ranch he had purchased. In the song, he comments on how their needs are not that different. They both need love, they're searching for things, they're sharing the same problems. Even beyond the lyrics, he seems to put heavy symbolic stock into things like who he will perform songs, particularly this song, with and how. He has performed Old Man as a solo song and with backing bands over the years, but since the 2010 death of his collaborator, pedal steel guitarist Ben Keith, who was on the original track with him, he publicly declared that he will never play Old Man again with a band. For Young, it often seems that the difference between old and young was largely arbitrary. And when it did make itself known, it was not so much having someone you've always known as an old man die, that we often expect or at least ready ourselves for, but having a fellow young man die, even if it's in old age. His collaboration and performance styles give us other opportunities to read into what seems to be a really earnest, reverent approach to aging, and often in his earnestness, rebellion, because of how uncommon it has become to be earnest. One thing that he does that I think is subtle but so powerful is a sort of passing of the torch. One that recognizes, though, that a flame isn't diminished by lighting another flame. Right now, his backing band is a group of younger musicians called Promise of the Real, which includes two of Willie Nelson's sons. And when I saw them play together at Desert Trip, which was a classic rock festival I went to in late 2016, I realized that there was this generosity and collaboration about the way that the guitar parts were split up between them on some of the songs. For example, when they played Cowgirl in the Sand, Neil Young let Lucas Nelson play the flashy solo part that he really used to play, and he played even when he collaborated with other people in the past. whereas he had been in the foreground, kind of playing the lead parts with the spotlight. At Desert Trip, Lucas got to play and even sort of relish further in those parts. The spotlight and attention had been passed to him, and it felt very literal. Alice collaborates with younger musicians as his backing band too, but in a different way. The Alice character is not about earnestness or vulnerability or sharing at all. He is the puppet master, the puller of strings. The one time he does let another band member, Chuck Garrick, the bassist, sing the lead vocals of a song, it's I Love the Dead, which is a song that comes after the Alice character has been executed in the guillotine and his disembodied head is being swung around on stage by a giant tattooed inflatable baby, all before Alice resurrects, re-emerges from a coffin on stage, and reclaims his role. That same villainous mastermind type manipulation applies to the song I highlight as well, I'm 18, which is the 1970 song off of Love It to Death. And in performing that song, he uses a crutch as, amongst other things, a conductor's baton, pointing at each performer to compel them to play, miming an air guitar. But the crutch's most interesting use is as a prop for humor and a self-aware wink at the disconnect between character and performer. Vince described it to me as Alice playing a joke on him, commenting on how Vince has gotten old and Alice has not. The crutch is an interesting choice here because at another point in No More Mr. Nice Guy, he mimes the lyric Little Old Ladies by pretending to use a walker. So why use a crutch for I'm 18? I consider it a really literal, potentially scathing interpretation where the crutch symbolizes using youth as a crutch in the sense that classic rock still really relies on tuning into the old hits and conversations. But most likely, it connects more to the meta-narrative of age as decline or disability. Scholars in aging studies and disability studies are doing a lot of good work in trying to cut those ties because there are quite a lot of people who need crutches at a young age and elderly people who don't need assistive tools at all. Part of the choreography of the crutch involves an oscillation between Alice pretending to need it and then brashly kicking it away, a sort of parallel to the back and forth explained in the song. I'm a boy and I'm a man. I've got a baby's brain and an old man's heart, living in this confused state of liminality and doubt that you're trying to escape from, but that escape doesn't necessarily just come from aging. The final move of the song is when Alice tosses the crutch away back over his head. Alice never really needed it. It was all just a joke, teasing Vince. It's poignant to note that the first time Alice uses the crutch choreo, and in doing so, started jokingly commenting on the disconnect between his youth and Vince's advancing age, was on the Madhouse Rock tour in 1979, which was just after Vince turned 30. So, to bring things to a close, youth is not wasted on the young by any means, but the set of characteristics that we call youth is misattributed to the young. As things are, youth seems to be, at its best, the domain of change, malleability, possibility, while being grown up is a fixed state, past tense. I think a good deal of the next steps of our sociocultural identity work will be to treat age as the performative identity that it is. There are all sorts of ways to define and contend with age and aging, and to root out ageist misattribution. And I think one of the ways of doing this, as many others in many areas have observed, is to increase visibility, to see all the different ways to sound and look and be a certain age, which can include and represent the values that we call youth, regardless of a person's age, and without being deemed inauthentic, disconnected, or abnormal. Maybe if one's age didn't dictate assumptions about how one should and could act authentically with the world, we wouldn't see such a tension about choices if, when, how to grow up or stay young. And we could finally address the confusion that has been the result of age and aging being seen as a sort of fantasy and nightmare at the same time simultaneously.